Sharing.
Great. Welcome to the webinar, Cuba's Humanitarian Crisis, a look at current challenges, U.S. policy, and opportunities for action. This webinar is sponsored by the Washington Interfaith Staff Community's Faith Cuba Working Group, which includes the Presbyterian Church, the National Council of Churches, the Florida Council of Churches, many of the mainline denominations, including the Methodists and the Lutherans, along with groups like Church World Service and the American Friends Service Committee. So welcome. Cuba is at a difficult crossroads and facing an unprecedented political, social, and economic crisis. It is affecting the daily lives and survival of ordinary people on the island, and there are historic shortages. The majority of Cuban people live with uncertain access to basic necessities and food. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans have been forced to sell their belongings and undertake dangerous journeys to reach the United States. Despite the crisis, U.S. policy towards Cuba continues to be stuck in an outdated approach focused on maintaining an embargo and economically strangling the Cuban people. Our Cuban church partners are urgently asking for U.S. Christians to advocate for an easing of U.S. economic restrictions and a change in U.S. policy to relieve the suffering of the Cuban people, help them to prosper in their own country, and include them fully in the family of nations. We have an incredible lineup of speakers today. Reverend Carlos Ham is the Director of Evangelical Mission at the Florida Bahamas Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Reverend Dr. Ham is the President Emeritus of the Caribbean Conference of Churches, has served as a pastor of the Presbyterian Reformed Church in Cuba for 40 years. He joined the World Council of Churches staff in Geneva, Switzerland in March of 2001 as program executive for evangelism. He served as the coordinator of the mission and ecumenical formation team, and finally as program executive for Diaconate in Latin America, Caribbean until 2013. In 2015, he was installed as the rector and professor of mission and diaconia at the Evangelical Seminary of Theology in Matanzas, Cuba. And until 2024. Most recently, he joined the Florida Bahamas Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America as Director of Evangelical Mission. Dr. Leo Grand is Professor of Government and a specialist in Latin American politics and U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America. Professor Leo Grand has been a frequent advisor to government and private sector agencies. He has written 5 books, including Our Own Backyard, The United States in Central America, 1977 to 1992. Most recently, he is co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. Previously, he served on the staff of the Democratic Policy Committee of the United States Senate and the Democratic Caucus Task Force on Central America of the United States House of Representatives. Professor Leo Grand has been a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow and a Pew Faculty Fellow in International Affairs. His articles have appeared in various international and national journals, magazines, and newspapers. Dr. Russ Meyer is Executive Director for the Florida Council of Churches, and he serves to elevate the faith of churches whose million members anchor communities across Florida. His doctoral work focused on designing community conversations that lead to collective action, and Dr. Meyer engages in statewide interfaith efforts on climate, healthcare, justice reform, refugees, and civic engagement. He leads the newly created Florida Faith Advocacy Office and the Council and convenes the Florida Interfaith Climate Action Network. Along with several activists and researchers, he has been a catalyst for realizing the transformative learning community in Tampa Bay to promote conversational leadership. He has also taught collegiate courses in ethics and world religions. He is also currently pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Jacksonville, which was founded in 1877. Also joining us will be Representative Jim McGovern from Massachusetts. He represents the 2nd District He has been the top Democrat on the powerful House Rules Committee since 2018, serving as chairman during the 116th and 117th Congress. He has worked hard on the Rules Committee to change business as usual on Capitol Hill and make Congress work in a more open, transparent, and bipartisan way. For example, he put in place rules to give all members of Congress more time to read bills. He required that bills go through the committee process instead of just being written behind closed doors. And he created a new office to create and retain congressional staff that reflect the diversity of the American people. Jim has spent his career in public service working to strengthen America's global leadership when it comes to protecting human rights and promoting peace. He serves on 2 commissions which monitor, investigate, and advocate on behalf of international human rights, the rule of law, and good governance. Those are the Congressional Executive Commission on China and the bipartisan Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. So welcome all of you. And we're going to start with Reverend Carlos Ham to get a perspective on what's happening on the ground in Cuba. Reverend Ham.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you once again, Catherine and brothers and sisters from the network for organizing this webinar. I will share with you a screen, and this way I'm going to make my presentation. Let's see. Here we go. So let me check my time here. So thank you once again for this invitation. And first of all, I bring you warm greetings on behalf of the Cuban Council of Churches and the various ecumenical, excuse me, organizations with which we work. And we appreciate very much that all these efforts are ultimately to reaffirm the consistent and historical solidarity that you have had with our churches and people in Cuba, not only in terms of providing humanitarian assistance, but also working on advocacy to create a more just environment in our relationships. So the current national situation, it is very critical. No, we have a shortage of medicines, food, fuel, public transportation, as we have never known before. Energy crisis with very extensive blackouts, extremely high cost of living. We have a huge inflation, and of course, the strong effects of the weather as a result of climate change that also affects us. Furthermore, there's a deep crisis of values, crisis of meanings, an ideological crisis of strong polarization. And the state is seeking consensus among the churches. Quite often, the leaders of the country talk about the importance of highlighting spirituality, where the churches play an important role, not only producing a sense of life, but also providing social service and care for those in a wider situation of vulnerability, mainly the elderly. The causes of this deep crisis are the tougher U.S. sanctions, the extraterritorial character of the embargo. The embargo, as you know, or the blockade, as we call it in Cuba, is not only affecting us bilaterally, our country, but it also has an extraterritorial impact. And more specifically, the fact that Cuba is included in the list of countries that sponsor terrorism, apart from the fact that it's unjust, it is hindering all our financial transactions since many banks globally are not sending funds to Cuba. Of course, well, the international financial recession, of course, is also affecting us, but it would be unfair to say that the cause of the crisis is due to external factors. No, we also have our own shortcomings, our mishandling of the economy. For example, during the COVID, the Cuban government introduced a monetary reorder, which provoked a strong inflation in our country. We have also a generalized corruption, crime, violence, which are increasing in our country as well. And of course, the COVID, as the whole world affected us strongly. And I always quote my brother, Dr. Russell, who will speak in a few minutes, when he said that Cuba, in spite of that, Cuba did 10 times better than the US, since we had 8,500 deaths in 1 million inhabitants, whereas you had 85,000 only in Florida of 22 million. Let's see. So those are the causes. Consequences. We have had demonstrations in the streets. For example, on July the 11th of 2021, people went out to the streets to protest because of the situation. And of course, we cannot deny that the media played an important role promoting hate and spreading fake news. I think one of the most critical and saddest consequences of the crisis that we're living is migration, much of it irregular migration. There's estimated that 500,000 Cubans sought refuge in the USA, excuse me, between the years 2021 and 2023. Counting nearly 5% of our population of 11 million. We had other migration waves. For example, in 1980, we lost around 125,000. In 94, 34,000. But this has been the biggest wave. And I compare it with when the body is bleeding, no, losing life. That's what we're losing in our country when we lose so many people, many of them very smart people. And also as a consequence of this crisis, we see a widening gap between rich and impoverished people. The state uses the euphemism of people living in situations of vulnerability. The word poor, poverty is like a bad word, but the fact is that we have a widening gap between those that have and those who do not have, as we have never seen before, starting to see beggars in the streets, etc. We have, of course, signs of hope. Not everything is lost. We have a boosting private sector in our country that is helping to invigorate our economy, the so-called MIPYMES. These are enterprises, both private, state, or hybrid, that are helping to refresh our economy. There is an improvement and a development of the tourist industry, in spite of the fact, as I mentioned before, the embargo targets very strongly the tourist industry, which is our main income source. Another important sign of hope is the solidarity of people like you, historically, mainly the churches and other organizations of the civil society that have played or are playing a pontifical role of building bridges, on top of the walls that have separated us. We have trade agreements with Russia, China, European Union, etc., which help us to renew our economy. And as under this slide of signs of hope, I put U.S. presidential elections and 3 signs of question marks. But I know that Dr. Leo Grande and Senator McGovern are going to speak more about that issue, which is quite hot as we speak. So when we see the churches as a church, we belong to the same church, regardless of the denomination where we serve and regardless of the country. But we like to see that we work in terms of reciprocity in spite of all our political differences. So we see us as a seesaw, no? In which, in order to have a balance, we have to stand on both sides and support each other. And I would like to end, since I am not a politician, but rather a theologian and a pastor, I would like to end quoting this text of Romans 15, 13 that says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." So, 10 minutes and a half. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Tim. And it's a delight to work in solidarity with you and our Christian partners, and believe that there is hope for the people of Cuba.
Thank you.
Now, we're going to move on to Reverend Dr. Russell Meyer, who's going to give us a perspective on the U.S. Church's work with Cuba and also issues around religious freedom.
Thank you, Catherine. Really appreciate the overview that Carlos provided. Look forward to hearing from our other panelists. I'm going to begin with a biblical quote from Paul's letter to the Ephesians, that in the cross of Jesus Christ, the wall of hostility has been brought down between us. And so the work that we do is about seeing beyond the wall of hostility that has been erected between our countries. The churches that we work with span from the Isle of Youth to Santiago de Cuba and Guantanamo. In one of my recent trips to Cuba, we were at our church in Guantanamo, and they held a special meeting for us. The church had a request to make to us, and that request surprised us all. They had over a dozen persons graduating from medical school out of that one congregation, and they were all there to meet with us. And they asked us how we could support them in bringing the message of the love of God through Jesus Christ through their profession of medical care, right? I've never been in a congregation that in the United States that ever turned out a dozen doctors in 1 year alone. And then to have them all focus on being the healing hands of Christ in their country and around the world. Of course, because of the things that have been happening from US policy, for those new doctors to go around the world and be the healing hands of Christ is almost impossible and forbidden. That's part of one of the things that has been laid out in these terrorism charges and the rest. I started going to Cuba in 2010, 2011. What we saw when we first went was just eye-opening. The situations of vulnerability, as Carlos described them. Children did not have shoes. Children were allowed milk every day, meat twice a week, and the elderly were allowed the same kind of ration. But average adults were limited in access to protein, right? That there was real rationing going on in the food. We ate very well, but it was a very modest meal that they served us. That was before President Obama began to institute changes. A couple of years later, we went back and all the children had shoes. And it was just astounding. And I turned to one of our folks and I said, how did these children get shoes? And they said, remittances. Family were finally allowed to send support back to their family in Cuba from the United States. And the first thing that people did was take care of their children, spend the money on their children. And in fact, walking through the streets of the city, you'd look into people's front windows, and the most common picture you saw, or you still see, is the family child, a big portrait of the family child inside the family living room. Cuba is a very family-centered, child-centered society. So it breaks my heart now. I get daily messages from our partners in both Santiago de Cuba and New Gerona. It breaks my heart to know that the kind of protein rations that they had back in 2010, they don't even have that. Meat is very hard to come by. It's extremely expensive, unlike anybody could ever imagine. People went to bed on New Year's Eve in 2019, and they woke up the next day with their bank accounts being 1/10 of value of the night before. And then in 2021, when new sanctions came down and et cetera, all of the advancement that we had seen take place in 8 or 9 years has all been reversed. People have to take their own bandages to the hospital in many places. And there's a real significant change between what people experience in Havana being the largest city, gets a lot access to a lot of resources before the rest of the country. If you're in the outlying areas, their famine is not far away from you. So the United Nations started bringing in the World Food Program to help support things. All of this is a direct result of international access to trade, which has been severely dampened by US policies. Being on the terrorism list has caused financial institutions to over-comply. And so their risk liability departments say, well, I know this may be permitted by OFAC and Treasury and State to a religious group or a humanitarian group, but we don't want to be involved in that line of business. And so we have found that even when we can present all of the legal documentation for sending humanitarian aid, we often have a hard time of getting the expenditure approved and passed through just this past month. I had a colleague who had $5,000 frozen by a U.S. bank because she was trying to transfer it to a friend to take to support the churches in Cuba. This is a regular kind of affair that happens. Even when we are very, very, very intentional about staying within the boundaries that the U.S. government has established for humanitarian aid and religious work in Cuba, we still can't do that work because financial institutions don't want to be involved. The most recent kinds of changes in rules that would, for instance, allow Cubans to bank in the United States are just a wealth transfer, because there's no open banking. That's one of the embargoed things. So we're saying, oh, you can put your money in an American bank, but you can't take it back home. We already have a financial crisis in Cuba. How it is helpful to take Cuban resources and bank them in South Florida and not allow people to take it back home is beyond me. We've been struggling for the last 150 years, since the Civil War, over whether or not Cuba will be able to have its own sovereignty and choose its own path based upon the political philosophy of Jose Marti and others, or is it going to be a client state, even a colony of the United States? And the churches, in the midst of this tug of war between what policy with Cuba is going to be, the churches have been about sharing the love of Christ and doing that quite openly. And so what we find right now is that the churches who are pursuing the gospel with everybody, in all the situations of vulnerability as they've been described, if they're trying to work to transform Cuban society from within, they're being put out in the cold by U.S. policy. And U.S. policy is only siding up right now with those forces that want to use religion to create an insurrection in Cuba. I'll just say this, though Carlos talked about how there's polarization that's happening in the Cuban society. That polarization is not necessarily arising out of Cuba itself. It's being very much fomented by expatriate voices in Miami and elsewhere in the United States. Cubans want to be able to live a full life according to the values that they have always cherished, which have to do with mutual solidarity and taking care of one another. And I'm just going to finish with this. The many visits and teams that I've led to Cuba, people come back amazed at how living the faith of the people of Cuba really is. And we should be supporting that kind of spiritual maturity in a nation, not punishing it.
Thank you, Russ. That really paints a stark picture of how our policy is contributing to this humanitarian crisis, and then our churches can't help to believe it because of our policy. So thank you. And now we're lucky to have with us Representative Jim McGovern, who's going to give a perspective from the Hill.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and I'm sorry to be late joining you, but I just came from a press conference with the nuns on the bus talking about America's priorities, and then they just scheduled an emergency rules committee meeting, which I have to go to on something that quite frankly is not an emergency. But putting that aside, I want to thank Catherine Gordon with the Presbyterian Church USA for inviting me to participate. I regret missing some of the other presentations. I admire all the people who are presenting today. And I think a lot of the details and analysis may have already been clearly laid out for you. But here's the bottom line. Cuba is in crisis. Clearly, Cuba's problems are Cuban problems. but Cuba's problems are also a U.S. problem. For the past several years, including, and I regret to say this, throughout the Biden administration, U.S. sanctions and restrictions have been part of the problem, a big, big part of the problem. The choice is whether we want to be part of the solution. And if the U.S. government is worried about large-scale migration from Cuba to the United States, then we should be helping Cubans to stay in Cuba. So many of the Cubans who are leaving the island are leaving because they can't put food on the table for their families. Yes, we should help to facilitate legal entry into the U.S. through humanitarian parole, but we should also be increasing the number of non-immigrant visas so people who want to visit family or carry out business transactions in the United States can more easily travel to the U.S. and return to Cuba. We should be removing all financial restrictions and bureaucratic obstacles that make it more difficult for other nations, international organizations, U.S. and foreign NGOs, and the faith community to deliver humanitarian aid to Cuba. We should remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. It never, ever belonged there, and it has caused immeasurable hardship to ordinary Cubans. By maintaining Cuba on that list, it makes a mockery of that list, where there are some nations that quite frankly deserve to be put on that list. And frankly, when times are hard, we all know that it's the most vulnerable who suffer the most: children, the elderly, women, and the Afro-Cuban community. I don't want to repeat what has already been said by other panelists, but it's true that the Biden administration has eased some of the restrictions toward Cuba, but let me be frank, it's not enough. And it certainly won't make a difference to the majority of Cuban people. I was in Cuba, last in Cuba in December of 2022, and I saw how people were struggling and suffering then. A year and a half later, it's gotten so much worse. The United States can do better. We all can do better. Cuba has fallen off the radar screen for most members of Congress. They don't believe it's worth their time or attention anymore. For Democrats, in large measure, that's because it doesn't appear to matter to the White House, except for Florida politics. 10 years ago, we started to see what a difference a real opening could make. We need that same attitude again, not just in the White House, State Department, and Congress, but most importantly, among grassroots faith and activist communities. You were the ones who made a difference 10 years ago. I remember well. I remember being part of the first one of the trips that the Secretary of State Kerry made to Cuba, and then I was with President Obama when he went to Cuba. It was a big deal and made a meaningful difference in the lives of average Cubans. You made a difference 10 years ago. You pushed and laid the groundwork for remarkable change, and let's all work together and make a difference again. And just a final thing I'm going to say, just as a member of Congress, as a citizen of the United States, U.S. policy toward Cuba is a relic from the Cold War. It is an embarrassment. It is hurting the very people we say we care about, but it also represents kind of the worst in our foreign policy. It makes no sense, and it is all about politics and not about realities. We need to change this, not only because it's the right thing to do for Cuban people, but quite frankly, it is a way to regain some of our stature when it comes to dealing with Latin America. So again, I thank you for having this call. I thank you for having me. And again, I apologize for zooming in late and coming and having to leave early.
Thank you, Representative McGovern, and thank you for making it possible to be here. I know you have a really busy schedule, and we really appreciate your time and really trying to be on this webinar to give your message of hope and motivation for the faith community to really speak up on Cuba. We're going to move to Dr. William Leogrand now, and we already have several questions in the chat about why does the U.S. continue to sanction Cuba, and Dr. Leogrand is going to give us an overview of what he called in one of his articles the theater of the absurd of U.S.-Cuba foreign policy.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to participate in the seminar here. And thanks to all the churches involved in Cuba Partners for all you do to help ease the humanitarian crisis that the Cuban people are facing these days. As most of you know, in the 2020 campaign, Joe Biden promised that he was going to return to President Obama's policy of engagement and normalization for the most part, he said. But in fact, he left all of Donald Trump's sanctions in place for the first 2 years that he was in the White House. He lifted some sanctions in May of 2022, as Congressman McGovern just mentioned, when he was facing a Latin American boycott of the Summit of the Americas because he was excluding Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela from participating. So a couple of the things that he did that were positive, at least partly positive. One was to partly restore people-to-people travel, which Trump had eliminated, but he left in place the prohibition on staying in government-owned hotels, which is all the large hotels. And that has meant that very few major travel providers have returned to the Cuban market because if they're bringing 30 or 40 people on a trip, they can't put them in private homes that only hold 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 people at a time. At the same time that Biden made the change in people-to-people travel, he also lifted Trump's restrictions on the amount of remittances that Cuban Americans could send to family members. But he left in place a prohibition on using the Cuban financial institution that received remittances. And the result was that Western Union wasn't able to restore wire service remittances for another full year until the Cubans changed their financial institutions. And at that same time, the president promised to relax some embargo restrictions in order to help the emerging Cuban private sector. But then he didn't do that for 2 months or 2 years, rather, and only actually made those changes just a couple of months ago. One other important thing that he did, though, and I want to mention it because it's had a significant impact for Cubans. He restaffed the U.S. Embassy, which Trump had downsized after the so-called sonic attacks on U.S. diplomats in Cuba, which we've never really figured out what caused. So a restaffed embassy has been able to resume processing immigrant visas so that Cubans don't have to travel to a different country to even apply for a visa. He's restored the 5-year entry visa for non-immigrants, particularly people who have family in the United States, which makes it much easier for people to go back and forth. And he's resumed diplomatic dialogues on important issues like migration and law enforcement. President Obama signed 22 agreements with Cuba in the last 2 years of his administration, all on issues of mutual interest. President Trump ignored all of those agreements. President Biden has, in fact, begun to restart some of the dialogues around those issues. And that's important for laying the foundations, at least, for an improvement in relations. But President Biden has also left a lot of important Trump sanctions in place. As has been mentioned a couple of times now, Cuba is still on the terrorism list, which blocks international financial transactions and also really constrains tourism from Europe, because a European now who travels to Cuba is not eligible for a visa waiver program to come to the United States. That means if they then want to come to the United States, they have to apply for a visa, wait for months to get an interview, pay a visa fee. So European tourism to Cuba as a result of this is down by about 50%. The Biden administration is also continuing to block oil shipments to Cuba from Venezuela by imposing sanctions on the companies that carry that oil. It's accused Cuba of modern slavery for sending doctors and medical personnel abroad, and it's threatened countries that receive those doctors and medical personnel with a loss of U.S. assistance if they continue. And it's left Title III of the Helms-Burton legislation in place to discourage foreign companies from investing directly in Cuba. So in short, the president has a kind of a bizarre hybrid policy. Part Obama's engagement, parts Trump's policy of regime change. Assistant Secretary Brian Nichols tries to rationalize this contradiction by saying that U.S. policy is tough on the government and soft on the Cuban people. But that's really impossible. There's just one economy in Cuba. And if you cripple that economy, you contribute to the immiseration of the Cuban people. And sanctions are obviously making the migration issue worse. Since 2022, a total of about 800,000 Cubans have come to the United States, either legally or illegally at the southern border. So if we look ahead, what would a Trump administration's policy look like? Well, Donald Trump doesn't really care about Cuba. In the first administration, he told his senior staff when they asked about Cuba policy, make Rubio happy. And in fact, Marco Rubio and Mario Diaz-Balart in the House of Representatives wrote Trump's Cuba policy. Trump would reverse the few openings that President Biden has pursued. And I think overall, he would return to a policy of maximum pressure, trying to cut off all external financial flows to Cuba in order to destroy the Cuban economy in the expectation that this would cause Cubans to rise up against their government. So what would this mean? More suffering for the Cuban people and more migration. What would a Harris administration policy look like? Well, it's hard to know. Vice President Harris has not been vocal on the Cuba issue over the years. In 2017, she did co-sponsor the Freedom to Travel bill that would have done away with the embargo on travel. She supported President Obama's opening to Cuba in 2014. And in the 2020 campaign, when she was still running for president, she called the embargo a failed policy. But once she became vice president, she was really non-committal. And I couldn't actually find anything she said about Cuba since assuming the vice presidency. So this suggests a few things that's probably not a high priority for her, that her approach is likely to be a cautious one, and therefore we probably can't expect a really radical departure from Biden's policy. But at the same time, she won't be constrained by what Biden did. And so changes on some things like the terrorism list and travel, perhaps, might be possible, especially if she keeps hearing from the grassroots. So one of the questions in the chat was, why do we still have sanctions on Cuba? And Congressman McGovern mentioned one of the reasons, domestic politics. It's the politics of South Florida. And under Biden, it was also Senator Menendez in New Jersey, who had a close relationship with the president from their time together in the Senate. Menendez, of course, will be gone next year. And Florida politics, well, we'll see what happens in the election in Florida. I'm not very hopeful that Democrats have much of a chance in Florida. So maybe those domestic political constraints will be substantially less in a Harris administration. Might Biden actually do something now that he's not running for re-election? Well, it's not impossible. I don't expect he would do something before the election for fear it might complicate the campaign for Vice President Harris. And if she is as cautious on Cuba as I think, she probably wouldn't want to see him do anything between now and then. But there is always the possibility he might do something during the lame duck period, that is to say, between the election and inauguration, regardless of who wins in November. President Trump took advantage of that lame duck period to put Cuba on the terrorism list. Perhaps President Biden would take advantage of it to take them off. But it is so important that elected representatives in the White House and in the Congress hear from their constituents so they know that this is an important issue to their constituents, especially the faith community, because that will give them no excuse to just continue to ignore this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Leah Grand. And I put in the chat our most recent action alert on the state sponsors of terrorism list. That's one of the key points that our coalition is advocating for right now. And I think a lot of people after the Obama administration lifted the sanctions didn't realize that now we have even more sanctions and are not aware of the dire humanitarian situation in Cuba. So it's very important for our church members and the denominations to really be a loud voice in educating people about what's going on and speaking to their members of Congress, because we were a strong force in getting the Obama administration to change its policy, and we need to regroup and speak out again. So there are several questions about Florida dynamics, Marco Rubio and the expat community in Florida and its influence on U.S. politics. Reverend Dr. Meyer, do you want to speak to that?
Well, let me get started, and Professor Leo Grande may want to correct me. But I want to begin with one word: sugar. It is sugar that brought down the Napoleonic Empire with the Haitian Revolution. Sugar had funded Napoleon. We got the Louisiana Purchase because of that. We were able to buy it and come forward. For many years, Cuba was the leading source of sugar. With the Cuban Revolution, the sugar plantations moved from Cuba to South Florida. Behind me is a picture of the Everglades. We drained the Everglades and turned them into sugar fields. One of the most persistent and powerful political donors in Florida is the sugar industry. And Marco Rubio's political career would not exist without that money. That's Bacardi rum, moved to Puerto Rico and etc. But so what you're looking at is this deep desire in the expatriate community in Miami to get all their land and property back, and to go back to the way Cuba was under one of the most oppressive regimes in the Western Hemisphere, which basically turned the population into a slave labor force de facto. People want their property, and then that's what Helms-Burton is about, and etc. is about restoring property. My experience is Cubans have moved far beyond that conversation. They're not invested in that conversation, but that's where the expatriate party is in South Florida. And the large landowners, the big plantation owners, the planter society moved to South Florida in force and funds so much of the antagonism toward Cuba today because they want their resource back, right? And so the kind of money that comes out of South Florida based upon the transplanting of those business interests to South Florida continues to fund this. And there's a long history in U.S. The Agricultural Committee in the House around sugar policy, and how much sugar policy for many years ran Cold War policy as well. And so there's just a long history here of people want the land back, and they really don't care about the Cuban people themselves. My personal opinion.
Sorry, thanks, Russ. Dr. Leo Grande, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't think I can improve on that.
Okay, so we have a question directly to, do you think the State Department officials are stuck in Cold War thinking, or have they moved to a new approach? And then there's another question. Why are Cuban leaders saying such negative things about the private sector? That's been some of the headlines in the recent stories about Cuba lately. And are they just deferring blame for their own mistakes in economic policy, or is this serious backsliding?
So first on State Department officials, it depends on the official, of course. But in my experience, most State Department officials who work on Latin America supported Obama's policy, don't think that a return to a policy of sanctions and hostility is in the best interest of the United States. But I'm afraid that people in the White House do have more of that Cold War mentality. You know, the president has said that the touchstone of his foreign policy is the conflict between democracy and authoritarianism. And, you know, we've identified as our global rivals Russia and China. Cuba has close relations with Russia and China, partly because it really has no choice. It needs large powers right now to get it through this crisis. But as a result of that, Cuba is put into the camp of adversaries in what seems to be shaping up as Cold War 2.0. On the issue of the recent criticism of the private sector, so I think there are two pieces to this, and I'm doing a little bit of speculating here, trying to look inside the black box of Cuban policymaking, which is really quite opaque. But I think it's been clear for a long time that there are some people in the Cuban leadership who have been uncomfortable with the economic reforms that Raul Castro started more than a decade ago, and are concerned that the growth of the private sector is a kind of slippery slope to privatization and an end to socialism that they fought for and spent their lives fighting for. On the other hand, there's another group of people who recognize that the old highly centralized Soviet model didn't work and still isn't working to the extent that it's still in place, and that they need to move more toward a kind of a hybrid economy like Vietnam or like China, and are moving in that direction. So that part of it is a deep, I think, ideological disagreement about the role of the private sector in a socialist economy. The second issue is that the way the private sector has gradually been allowed to increase has had a lot of problems, a lot of overregulation, and as a result of that, people in the private sector have been creative in working around these obstacles, not always in ways that are strictly legal. And so now you're seeing people saying, well, you know, there are real excesses here. They're not paying their fair share of taxes. They're not contributing here. They're exploiting their workers and not obeying labor laws. And a lot of those things, in all honesty, are true of a lot of the places in the private sector. The important thing is to fix those remedies without killing the private sector, which has become the most dynamic sector in the economy.
Thank you. And Joel Ortigo do Pico is watching our webinar, and he just let us know that more than 60 pastors and national leaders are at the Cuba Council of Churches watching the webinar with us in solidarity. So we're glad that you're here with us. We have a couple of questions about influence. I know when the Obama administration changed the policies, the Pope was involved with that as well. And there's a question about the Roman Catholic Church and does it have any influence? And then we also have a question about the push from union leaders. There was just an announcement from a union in California that was pushing to get Cuba, that voted to call for the US to take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. So so I guess those two questions: does the Catholic Church have any influence? And what about these union leaders pushing for a change? Who would like to? Reverend Ham?
Yes, thank you. Regarding the first question, the involvement of the Catholic Church, of course, it has a lot of influence. Not long ago, the Council of Cuban bishops met with the highest leadership of our country President Miguel Díaz-Canel and other members of the party to express some concerns regarding the situation in Cuba, regarding the involvement of the government, of the party, etc. The state and the party is open. They engage in a lot of dialogue with many sectors of society, and therefore the Cuban government appreciates hearing from the Catholic Church. I think it's important to mention that all the last three popes visited Cuba, and Pope Francisco, who also went to Cuba, Francis, who is a Latin American and have had a long-standing relationship with the leadership of the Catholic Church, also has had very important and open positions regarding the Cuban reality. Just to mention, for example, Pope Francis played an extremely important role precisely in enabling the normalization of relationships. I appreciate that it has been mentioned, the improvement of the relationships between Cuba and the USA, with the sending back to Cuba the Cuban Five. And it's important to mention that Pope Francis played a very important role in that process. So yes, Catholic Church also plays an important role in providing humanitarian aid through Caritas and other social service agencies that belong to the church. We appreciate very much, as part of the ecumenical movement, the involvement of our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters and accompanying the Cuban people.
And recently, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops called for Cuba to be taken off the state sponsors of terrorism list, and we're getting some attacks about that. So they are a partner in this work. And who would like to address the question about the unions and the role of the unions?
Well, I can speak to that in a general sense. You know, obviously, unions are an important part of the base of the Democratic Party. And when I mean, you know, Joe Biden and now Kamala Harris are depending on union activism to help them win back, or to hold on to, I should say, the so-called blue wall of Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. So they have to listen to the union movement when it takes a strong position on an issue that's important to it. So I would say, you know, it's one additional voice from the grassroots that, you know, I think has a cumulative effect, whether it's the faith community, the trade unions, local town councils, all of which are basically saying this policy doesn't work. It doesn't serve the interests of the United States, and it doesn't serve the interests of the Cuban people, and it needs to change.
Thanks. So in terms of what people can do, besides calling on the administration to take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list, what are other areas that people can, or actions that people can take to help push the administration and change this policy? And also, there's a question. They said it was said that it wasn't possible to hurt the Cuban government without hurting the Cuban people. Are there ways to help the Cuban people without strengthening the Cuban government?
So let me just weigh in on this false idea that you could hurt the Cuban government but not hurt the Cuban people. It's really based on trying to read the Cuban situation through the American political system. And the Cuban political system is vastly different from the American political system. In the American political system, most people aren't involved. There's many non-party aligned people as there are Democrats or Republicans. They're just you're just not involved. But in Cuba, the political system is organized from your neighborhood block on up in tiered layers of representative voice up to the General Assembly. And so the most basic elections is people on the block deciding who they want to be their block captain, if you will, right? And so you have to imagine in the United States, if our political system required that you had to get together with all your neighbors once a year and decide who you want from your city block to be the representative to the city council to bring your affairs forward, we'd have almost everybody involved in our political system. And so this notion that somehow you can hurt the government but not hurt the people simply breaks down because of the way Cuba organizes its society from the street level all the way up. And so it's just a false idea out the gate. If we really want to have a positive effect, then we need to understand the way the other person actually operates. And as long as we want to sort of drop our framework for what political life ought to look like on Cuba, we're never going to have a successful policy, no matter what we want our outcomes to be, because we're just dealing from falsehood to begin with. And so, yeah, at a certain level, you can say we're not going to use these hotels because they're owned by the state government and et cetera, and all that sort of stuff. But as we heard, it said earlier that meant even though people can go and travel, there's no place for them to stay. It's a false equivalency. Cuba's been in the process over the last 2 decades of trying to shift from the state being the primary employer to everyone being able to have a paying job on their own out of a small business, private family stuff, and et cetera. So it's been in the process of changing where wages come from. And we have prevented that process from developing through our financial instruments, through our embargoes, and et cetera. I'll give you one final example. Santiago de Cuba wanted to build up its harbor. It has one of the most wonderful natural harbors in all of the Caribbean basin. Of course, they couldn't do that through any US companies because of the embargo. So they went to China and they got started. Well, they couldn't keep up with the China payments. So the terminals there are like half unfinished, and the nation's in deep debt to China just on that project alone, plus many, many others. If we didn't have the embargo, all the dreams that people in Miami have about the prosperity and economic success, those would have evolved over time in a new way, in a completely new way. Santiago de Cuba would be one of the most functional international ports in the Caribbean, and et cetera. Our policy just breaks the people of Cuba. They've chosen a political system for the main part because it's participatory at the very street level, and we punish church people who get involved in it. And so our policy needs to change, and it needs to begin with actually understanding the way Cuban society works today, rather than trying to recreate the way it worked in 1949.
Let me add just one very practical footnote to what Reverend Meyer just said. And that is, if you're someone who wants to help alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Cuba right now, but you don't want to see the resources you contribute end up in the government's coffers, give money to the churches, to the NGOs that are right now providing humanitarian assistance to Cuba. It's desperately needed. And recognize, though, at the same time, that there are U.S. policies that make it harder for that humanitarian assistance to get to the Cuban people. So it's not an either or. It's not, humanitarian assistance and we can ignore the policy. You really have to change the policy in order to facilitate the humanitarian assistance that people so desperately need.
It's absolutely on track. It took us 2 years to get several containers of material and resources into Cuba, going through Norway, with funds being frozen in the US. But at the end of it all, we had almost $500,000 worth of food, medicine, and solar panels. So we've been able to help our churches erect solar panels in 2 or 3 locations that then not only provide power, constant power, to the churches themselves, but to people in the local neighborhood and etc. But we had to write a letter. We had to call out Senator Menendez. We had to go through a lot of work to get money released and to get licensed OFAC paperwork processed. So we've got to have both. So the Presbyterian Church, Lutheran Church, the American Friends Committee, the Alliance of Baptists, are all places. The Episcopal Church in Cuba is part of the Episcopal Church here in the USA. And there are a lot of faith communities that are doing this work. You can send money through them, and it will do the kind of thing that Dr. Leo Grande is saying.
And our Presbyterian Cuba Partners Network was trying to get a container of medical supplies in, and it took them over a year to get those in. And but not only are we trying to get aid in, we are also sorry, Reverend Carlos Ham has to drop off now. Would you like to give us a last message about a message from our Cuban partners to the U.S. churches?
Yes, I want to reiterate what I said at the very beginning. Our gratefulness, our appreciation for all your support historically, consistent support. As I mentioned also at the beginning, we believe that we belong all to the same church, and different political expressions, different nations, different denominations, but we belong to the same church, and therefore, as the Apostle Paul says, when one member of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. So thank you. Thank you for your suffering together with us, but also for prophetic action. Also to tell you that we are accompanying your nation through our prayers in this very critical moment in the USA, when you are organizing, preparing for general elections. We wish you well as a nation, and we wish well that the result will be also for the benefit of our country, in order that we can enjoy normalized relationships as we are living in the 21st century. Thank you. Blessings, and thank you,
Carlos. And we're scheduled to go to 1:15. So just well, to have a few more minutes of discussion before we close. And I just wanted to say that not only are the churches trying to get donations into the island, we are also advocating through the Cuba Faith Working Group, and have repeated meetings with State Department officials and administration officials, and have had meetings with members of Congress to let them know of the difficulties that we are having getting aid in, and also advocating for them to take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. So the national offices of the churches are working hard at that as well. Why don't I stop there and give Russ and Leo Grande a few minutes for last words.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Well, I guess I'll start. I would just, I think, reiterate what has been a common theme through all of our presentations, and that is the hardship that the Cuban people are going through right now, the responsibility, at least in part, of U.S. policy for having created that situation, and therefore, I think the obligation that we as citizens of the United States have to petition our government for redress of grievances. That is to say, to get them to change this policy, which doesn't serve the interests of the United States. And in some ways, you know, that's an important thing to recognize. It's not a policy that advances the interests of the United States. If anything, it is aggravating the migration crisis that we face. It is alienating us from our Latin American and European allies. It is preventing progress with Cuba on important issues of mutual interest. And it's not paying any dividend anywhere. It's not making the human rights situation in Cuba any better. It's not making Cuba a more democratic country in our sense of a multi-party democracy. It's not having any beneficial effect anywhere. And yet we continue it partly for ideological reasons, partly for reasons of domestic politics. And I think it's really incumbent on American citizens to keep telling our government that this has gone on long enough. We've got a record now of more than 60 years of this policy failing. And we have a 2-year period in the end of Obama when, in fact, our relationship improved dramatically. We were able to sign 22 bilateral agreements on issues of mutual interest. A number of 53 Cuban political prisoners were released as part of that. We got back Alan Gross. Cuba agreed to open up the internet, which has proven to be enormously important for the growth of Cuban civil society and greater freedom of expression on the island. So there's lots of things that happened in those 2 years. We made more progress in the relationship and more progress on things that serve the interests of the United States than the previous 60. And so we should go back to a policy that made sense and that worked.
Reverend Meyer.
That's so well said. Thank you, Dr. Leo Grande. You know, I was reading some of the notes here, and there's some people who don't share the views that I've shared. I'm not certain that fully appreciate what I'm trying to say. I mean, given my outlook on the world, there are political parties in the United States. If I showed up to participate, they would kick me out the door. So participation is one thing, and whether or not people are willing to listen to your point of view is another thing. And what I've learned over time and experience in the ministry and in family and etc., is that when a community is under a great deal of stress and when they see that their very survival is threatened, there's only certain conversations they want to have, and they do not. They're really hard on people who want to change the subject away from where the pain is coming from. And so Cuba's having this difficult discussion around what its pains are and where those pains are coming from. And if people want to get into the conversation by saying we need to overthrow the government and start over again, it's a non-starter. It's just a non-starter. Do I think it should be that way or not? It's beside the point. It's the reality that is there. Here's what I see from the churches that are involved in the life of Cuban people. They are not trying to go at any political conversation. What they are trying to do is meet human need where they see it. And they're trying to remain faithful to the gospel and not engage in the polarization. There are other communities who think the polarization is the way they should be practicing their religion. And so there is a divide in the religious community about what people should be doing in Cuba from a faith perspective. I'm with the people who want to meet the human need, who don't want to spend their energy in polarization, but what they want to spend their energy in doing is bringing the good out of everybody that they can. They want to work with everybody that they can, and they want to be a witness to the gospel of peace that they've learned from Jesus Christ. There are certainly other religious voices with other resources coming out of the United States and other places that don't want to have a conversation about peace in Cuba. They want to have a conversation about changing the regime. And changing the regime isn't going to meet human need. It's just going to change who's in power. And so what we're trying to do in our accompaniment work with Cuba is listen very closely to what our Cuban brothers and sisters are saying, what our Cuban siblings are saying about how they are living out the faith of Jesus Christ in their situation, under their circumstances, and their vastly different circumstances that I live in Jacksonville, Florida. And it's rather daring for me to judge their faithful response when everything that they're challenged by, I can walk down the street and get what I need without any question. And they have to scramble for days and weeks, etc., to get the basic necessities. We must appreciate how people of faith, of being faithful in a set of circumstances they did not create for themselves, but are continuing to be held in place by the fence that's been put around their nation.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. I wish we could continue this discussion. I just want to remind people that we need to take action. There is a action alert in the chat, and we'll also send an alert out with all of the other links that have been brought up in the webinar, and you'll also get a recording in the follow-up email. So you can use this as a resource at your church. And we're glad that you participated. We thank you for turning out in a large number to hear us. And we're also really grateful to our wonderful speakers, Dr. Leo Grand, Dr. Meyer, Representative McGovern, and Reverend Carlos Ham for taking time out of their busy schedules. So thank you.